Hello, my name is John Zirkle, and this is my presentation for SO 305 Intersections of Crime with Dr. Riley Clasdell. The topic of my presentation is race and felony disenfranchisement. First, I thought I should start my presentation out by defining exactly what felony disenfranchisement means, and then I will discuss how race is involved in felony disenfranchisement. According to procon.org, felony disenfranchisement, this is the exclusion of someone from the right to vote, which is what is known as disenfranchisement, because of their conviction of a serious crime. In this case, a felony, which usually means that the crime is severe enough to warrant incarceration for at least a year or longer. How does this play into this? In 2010, approximately 23% of the black population had felony convictions. This means that almost a quarter of the black population has been stripped of their voting rights. I found this picture, which I thought was very fitting for the topic. Here you see African Americans holding a sign stating that voting is a right, which it is. Where else do we really strip someone of their constitutional rights, such as free speech? The other sign talks about how it is our voices, our issues, and our vote. This signifies how African Americans are not even allowed to vote on the issues that impact them the most, which is not justified. Okay, now for a little background on the issue. Laws bearing the voting of those with felony convictions date back to the late 19th and early 20th century. So this would be going back to the late 1800s and early 1900s. So this is post-Civil War era. During that time, Southern electorate were trying to neutralize the effect on the black vote. Since severe racism related to slavery was still rampant, the last thing that the racist Southern electorates wanted to do was give African Americans political power by allowing them to vote. Therefore, ultimately, felony disenfranchisement has served to undercut African American political power. Bans for having felonies dates back to 1860s and 1870s, and this happened in the wake of the 15th Amendment, which gave blacks the right to vote. The 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits the federal, state, and state governments from denying a citizen the right to vote based on that citizen's race, color, or preference, or previous condition of servitude, which refers to slavery. Felony bans were strengthened during the Jim Crow era. In essence, Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that enforced uh, racial segregation throughout the southern United States. Also, in 1901 in Alabama, the felony ban has been extended to minor offenses that involved moral servitude in an effort to exclude even more black people from voting. This even further disenfranchised African Americans because they were much more likely to be charged and convicted of a crime, felony or misdemeanor, than a white person was, whether or not they were actually guilty. Some current data that I found on this issue that was in 2014 midterm elections, it was thought that 6 million people were barred from voting in the 2014 midterm elections. This disenfranchisement of voters then carried over to the 2016 presidential election, in which an estimated 6.1 million were not allowed to vote in the 2016 presidential election due to felony disenfranchisement. There was a lot of court cases that went back and forth during the election year in which there was an attempt to keep more and more people from being allowed to vote, not only for felony disenfranchisement, but there was a lot of voter ID requirement issues that further suppressed minority votes. Currently, Alabama has one of the highest rates of felony disenfranchisement, 7.2% of its overall citizens and 15% of its black citizens. The statistics showed that 1 in every 13 voting age African Americans cannot vote, a disenfranchisement rate more than 4 times greater than that of all other Americans. I found several interesting charts that illustrated several important facts when it comes to felony disenfranchisement and race. The first is here on this slide. It shows the incarceration rates by race and ethnicity, which I thought was interesting. There was a greater disparity when it comes to blacks and whites when it comes to felony arrest, and there are between Hispanics and whites when it comes to felony arrest. The rates of felony arrest of blacks are 4.38 times the rate of felony arrest of whites. On the other hand, the felony arrest of Hispanics are only 1.5 times the rate of felony arrest of whites. When it comes to prison populations, the rates of blacks are 7.46 times the rates of whites. On the other hand, in looking at prison populations, the rates of Hispanics are only 1.81 times the rate of whites. Then go over and look at the third strike rates. The rates of third strike sentences are 12.7 times the rates of whites, while Hispanics are only 1.46 times the rates of whites. This graph shows the severe discrepancy between the rates in which sentences are applied to blacks as compared to whites. Slide 6 is a graph showing the incarceration rates of the United States when compared to other countries. The United States has the highest rate of incarceration rates when compared to other developed countries. The U.S. incarcerates 666 individuals per 100,000 people. Russia was the next with the incarceration rate of 430 individuals incarcerated per 100,000 people. On this particular chart, India was the lowest with 33 individuals incarcerated per 100,000. Next is a very interesting graph from Mother Jones that shows which states allow felons to have their voting rights back and which do not. 2 states impose no voter restrictions for felons. Those states are Vermont and Maine. 14 states allow felons to resume their voting, such as their prison sentences, as soon as their prison sentence is completed. Those states are Oregon, Utah, Montana, North Dakota, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. 27 states allow voting rights to be returned once the prison sentence, parole, and in some other cases, waiting period has been served. Not going to list those, but you can see them on the map. However, I do want to mention that 8 states never allow felons to resume the right to vote. Those states are Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Alabama, all 4 notably southern states. And then also Iowa, Wyoming, Nevada, and Arizona. Next, I want to talk about some of the social implications that were identified when it comes to felony disenfranchisement, especially when it comes to race. First, as we saw in the graphs earlier, felons are disproportionately from the ranks of racial minorities and the poor. One implication of this is higher rates of imprisonments for blacks and Hispanics limit their ability to participate in political process and to affect changes in politics and criminal justice system. Felon disenfranchisement laws tend to worsen situations of deprivation and leads to more, not less, criminality. Second, felon disenfranchisement laws need to be more exclusion from society than exclusion from create stigma. This can ultimately lead to more disruptions in family structure as well. There are some obvious political implications, especially when looking over what has happened over the past couple of election cycles. First, disenfranchisement laws tend to make more votes from Democratic than Republican candidates. Analysis has shown that this played a decisive role in the U.S. Senate elections in recent years. Of interest is that at least one Republican presidential victory would have been reversed if former felons had been allowed to vote. Further, at least one previous Democratic presidential victory would have been jeopardized had contemporary rates of disenfranchisement that prevailed during that time. Last, what can be done to this to address the disparity of that felony voter disenfranchisement has caused? One option will be to remove conviction-based restrictions on voting rights altogether. The question should be asked, is it even fair or reasonable to strip away someone's right to vote just because they have committed a felony crime? At the very least, restore voting rights in federal elections to citizens convicted of a felony so that the ability to vote in federal elections is not subject to varying state laws. Next, when criminals are stripped of their rights, the judge should have to identify the important state interests served by such disenfranchisement. If disenfranchisement laws stay in place, then judicial systems should specify the crimes in which disenfranchisement is reasonable and proportionate response. Last, criminal justice systems should require that imprisoned offenders only be excluded from voting if loss of the vote is imposed by a judge as part of the actual criminal sentence. Legislation should also have to specify that restoration of the right to vote following release from prison is automatic and immediate. Here are my references, and thank you.